Okay. So you can obviously take your map out, but we're not actually doing any mapping tonight. So be map 3. If you want to just reference it, but I try to show it all. So okay, I'm gonna try and get through the introduction recap here as quickly as I can. So yeah. So hello, I hope everybody is doing great. Welcome to week 24 of Biblical Interpretations. As is tradition, my name is James. I'm a husband and a father, and I own an automotive business. I have a degree in Biblical and Theological Studies in Ancient and Eastern History, although I'm not an expert in anything. We started this class back in October to discuss the specific epistemological and hermeneutic framework I've developed over the course of my life. We spent the first 8 weeks building a foundational paradigm so that I could say this sentence and hope it makes sense. The revelation of God is inherently contradictory. The biblical text describes a God defined beyond all knowledge that also wants to be known. The moment the knowledge of God transcends the boundary between what is not known to what is known, that God is no longer transcendent, but rather continuous and becomes defined by what is known. And so this is the fundamental concern of the biblical text. How can humanity know God without God being entirely defined by all that is known? This is the fundamental issue we're seeking an answer to. Another way to think of it is how God can be known as this without becoming known as something like this. So we discussed the epistemological gap between the tangible manifestations of intangible cognitions and how use and oral tradition are really the only way to bridge between the two. So whether it's the identity and knowledge of a Samaritan footbath only to be known by its continued use taught down for generations, or a physical object like baguette and all the intangible cultural heritage of the knowledge and actions and processes on how to make it, or any written text, and how writing is the tangible manifestation of intangible thoughts, and how writing is a summary of what could have been said or thought, how this creates a hermeneutic issue of intended meaning being an intangible goal of an author, and that authorial meaning can be lost when words transcend into writing. So I've been using UNESCO's preservation of tangible and intangible heritage as a catch-all example for all matters of tangible and intangible knowledge, and how what transcends between the two, what makes the intangible known, is the oral tradition and use passed down through generations. As soon as oral tradition and use ceases to exist, the intangible heritage will cease to exist. And we see these issues play out at Mount Sinai in the text in Exodus, how the revelation of the intangible God can only be about the use of its tangible manifestation, and why the knowledge of God revealed at Sinai are commandments and not something else. We discussed the tabernacle, or better known as the dwelling place, and how the dwelling place is a physical representation of the same epistemological paradigm that we've been discussing. And we've been charting every step in the epistemology, how the knowledge of God to humanity continues to move farther and farther and farther from the ideals of Eden, as humanity's proximity to God continues to be less and less tangible. And so we arrive at the conclusion that the only result of these epistemological gaps is the idea of a prophet, and how you know who or what a prophet is the point of any and all religious texts or claims, in my opinion. And I made the claim that anyone who is first across the boundary between the noun and the unknown of any semantic definition of a thing is a prophet about the knowledge of a given thing, such as Wilbur and Orville Wright and the intangible knowledge of human flight manifesting in the tangible form of an airplane, or Neil Armstrong and the 11 other astronauts who went to the moon and became prophets of the moon by transcending the intangible knowledge of the moon and making it tangible through the experience of stepping foot on it. Or Babe Ruth being a prophet of baseball by significantly expanding the knowledge of the possibilities of home runs in a manner never thought possible before him, and thus revealing new knowledge of baseball that changed the semantic identity of baseball forever after him. So prophecy is the yellow line. A prophet is someone who makes the unknown transcend into the known. So we read in Numbers 12 where Miriam, the sister of Moses, asked the question, who is a prophet? And we rationalize a spectrum of the semantic definition of a prophet. that there are different levels or tiers to what prophecy is or can be, and how in the text no prophet is more of a prophet than Moses. From here, I made the following statement that is worth repeating, as it is probably the second biggest claim that I can make in this class. So 1, from Moses onward, the entire rest of the biblical text is significantly concerned with the revelation of who and what a prophet is. 2, it does not matter where you cap or claim the text ends, that first statement is true. 3, where you cap the text or say it ends, the point in time you claim revelation from God via oral tradition through the mediation of a prophet stopped, that is the foundational semantic definition of your religion. So for example, if I use the footbath as a footbath, it is then known as a footbath. But if someone comes along and says to use it as a bread pan, and you use it as a bread pan, then it is a bread pan. But is it then still a footbath? The object doesn't change, but its semantic shifts based on its use. In short, the point being, Moses invented the idea of what a prophet of an intangible God is. The Torah has the right to stake that claim, and it does. What we see in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy is that Hashem does not want a semantic shift to Hashem's identity, because every time this is done, it is by definition not the identity of the intangible God. And this is why it is possible to believe you worship the correct identity of Hashem and can thus create an idol or a false god. All an idol is a shift in the identity of God based on semantic use, as we see in Exodus 32. And this is why I love the fact that the identity of the knowledge of Hashem is in the revelation of commandments, because that is information that you can know and something that you can act on and do something with. So we read as much of Deuteronomy as we could, and we saw the second generation repeat the covenant at Sinai. Moses dies on Mount Nebo, and Joshua becomes the next prophet. And we read Joshua 1. But we see a shift in the people's response. All communication is now firmly, exclusively through mediation of a prophet. God speaks to Joshua, Joshua speaks to the people speak to Joshua, and Joshua speaks to God. And we read Joshua 2, and we started a new map number 3. And we journeyed from Mount Nebo to Shittim, and we read Joshua 4, where they crossed the Jordan and journey from Shittim and Mount Nebo to Gilgal. And they pitch the dwelling place, the tabernacle, and they keep the Passover, having accomplished finally entering the land for the first time since Genesis and the story of Joseph. They then capture Jericho and proceed from Jericho to Ai. Hello.
You missed the thank you times. If we say thank you to your teacher.
Thank you, teacher.
Thanks.
Proceed to where
Ai.
Thank you.
So they go from Jericho to Ai. And after capturing Ai, they then head north up the ridge route, and we read Joshua chapter 8, and that Joshua goes up to Mount Ebal, and we see the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 11 and Deuteronomy 27. Joshua places stele of the Torah on top of Mount Ebal. Half of the tribes are at the bottom of Mount Ebal, and the other half are at the bottom of Mount Gerizim. And in between the mountains are the priests and the Ark of the Covenant. And the blessings and the curses of the Torah are shouted at each mountain. And so we map the journey from Ai north up the ridge route to Mount Ebal. We circled Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And in between the two mountains, we find Shechem, the city that has been repeatedly from the book of Genesis on, the place that is the sign of the fruition of the covenant that God made to Abraham. We see the building of an altar at Shechem to be repeated in every single generation as they enter into the land. And this was an important moment in our reading, because this proves one of the essential beliefs I hold, and that is that the land itself is a hermeneutic tool. If you aren't from here or haven't visited here or are not looking at a map when you read, you would not know the text in Joshua is describing a scene at Shechem, and you would miss the generational repetition that began in Genesis, and that would be lost in your interpretation. And so upon arriving at Shechem in Joshua 8, we come to the first major point in the text in which this statement that I've made becomes true. Because there are, to this day, a people group who live at Mount Gerizim, who believe Moses was the prophet of Hashem, and who end their biblical text after Deuteronomy. In other words, this people group do not believe there is any prophecy after Moses. So this people group are called the Samaritans. And to this day, they have a functioning temple on top of Mount Gerizim overlooking Shechem. And they still use the commandments of the Torah to this day. They believe everything we read in Deuteronomy 27 and Joshua chapter 8 happened on Mount Gerizim. And so this is a picture that I took in 2011 when I went to the Samaritan temple and had the privilege of observing the Passover sacrifice, which they do every year to this day. So the preservation and ongoing use of Samaritan culture is indistinguishable from the Torah, as would be the case of any other ethnic group today continuing to use their own cultural heritage. This is the claim the Samaritans make, and it is their quintessential identity. And I also would say it is their right. And so we read the UNESCO submission from 2012 when Samaritan culture and the sites on Mount Gerizim were proposed to UNESCO to become a World Heritage Site. And we read in the listed submission that it is not the fact the Samaritans are on top of a mountain that makes their heritage unique, but rather it is the continued use ongoing for generations that has no real comparison. The uniqueness of the Samaritans is that the preservation of oral tradition via ritual use is built into what they are preserving in their use. In essence, making them the preservers of the preservation of the oral tradition, which to me is what historicism and academia is fundamentally seeking in all of knowledge. And so I propose two questions that I think the existence of the Samaritans requires everyone else to have to think about. One, the first point to ponder is this: if you are an atheist or you find no value in religious thought, the question is, do people have a right to define their cultural heritage and its value to their self-identity and existence? From the most deconstructed or diminished point of view, at a minimum, the Torah is the cultural heritage of Samaritan culture. Do they not have a right to that? If the answer is yes, they have a right, then that means this text is more than just religion, as it is the foundation of an entire ethnogroup. Ought that information not be known? Ought that not be preserved? And if you go down that route, that train of thought, you are left having to rationalize why this text holds such meaning to this group of people. In other words, no matter how you slice it, the biblical text holds useful meaning in its use. It's not religion, it literally is who they are. To diminish this of the Samaritans, I dare say, is outright racist and anti-human. The second point to ponder is this: if you claim any theological belief stemming from Abrahamic tradition, you must rationalize why the Samaritans should believe in any prophecy or revelation after the Torah. And this is the greatest problem pertaining to any and all Abrahamic faith traditions, as far as I can rationalize. If you believe Jerusalem or the Vatican or Mecca are the places where God placed its name, you have to rationalize how you know if a prophet came after Shechem. You have to rationalize how you know that prophet is a prophet of Hashem. And upon arriving at this point, we run into our first major issue. The Samaritan Torah is slightly different than the Torah most Jews and Christians use and are aware of. And one of the biggest differences in the tradition is that the place Hashem will place the name is on Mount Gerizim, a claim first made in the Ten Commandments in the Samaritan Pentateuch, which we read last week from the Samaritan Torah. So this is not in any of those Bibles back on that wall, but this is in the Samaritan Torah. This whole section. No, Exodus. This would be in, so they consider this to be the 10th commandment. This is Exodus during the giving of the 10 commandments at Mount Sinai. They in their text, there's a commandment to build an altar on Mount Gerizim. It's a fundamental difference between the Samaritan Torah and every other Torah. So there's actually like 7 differences between like the Jewish Torah and the Samaritan Torah. Some of those differences are really minor. Some of them are major, like this one. This is probably the biggest difference. Okay, and so here we are at Shechem, finally returned from Egypt. And so now I have a few things I want to say or address before we continue forward. So one, I am not interested in making a claim that the Samaritans are right or wrong. I'm not interested in making a claim that the Samaritan Torah is older or later than the Jewish Torah. It is at this point in time where most people would lean towards historicism and textual criticism to try to answer a question like, which one is correct? Trying to answer if the Samaritan or Jewish versions of the Torah is the correct one, to me, misses the point. Typically, the academic assumption is whatever is older is original. I am not interested in this for a variety of reasons. I think focusing on that will detract from any hermeneutic goal. I also think oral tradition overrides that. Oral tradition overrides what can be believed to be known about historicism. I said it before and I'll say it again. When a text is written does not prove when it was conceived. 2, I am not trying to make a claim about what is correct or not. I'm not saying the Samaritans or Jews or Christians or Muslims or Mormons or the flying spaghetti monster is right or wrong. Rather, I am trying to take each epistemological belief as its own data point. I personally believe the totality of what can be known to be believed is how you can learn the most. Which brings us back to a statement I made in week 1. Doubt is the filter of truth. I believe all ethnic and religious identities have value in their epistemological contribution to the knowledge of Hashem. I also believe it is possible to learn positives from negatives. In other words, even if something is wrong, learning what is wrong can help you understand what you believe is right. I don't believe, or 3, I don't believe any farther progression of the epistemological expansion of the knowledge of God means that a previous one ceases to exist or should cease to exist. This isn't the case in pretty much anything else we can think about. I don't see why it shouldn't be the case here as well. In other words, I don't believe the existence of Judaism means that what makes Samaritans Samaritans should cease to exist. I also don't believe what makes Christianity Christianity means Judaism or Samaritans should cease to exist, or Muslims or Mormonism, or spaghetti monsters, or even atheism for that matter. Which, to be clear, if you think about what I just said, yes, I just said even from the position of atheism, religious heritage, identity, and ethnicity holds immense value. And I do not believe any of these things should cease to exist, but rather should be known, celebrated, explored, and preserved. 4, I am not an expert, not in the least bit. In fact, the hardest task that we have moving forward is the limitation of what I myself know or believe, which is a reflection of my own epistemological expansion over my life. It's a reflection of my own epistemological belief and deconstruction over time. I can't change what I've been exposed to and how those things have influenced me, good or bad. So I apologize in advance if I say anything about any person or people or heritage that is not of my own, especially if I say something that is actually wrong. All I can do at best is communicate a reflection of my own mind based off of what I've learned. For example, I know very little about Samaritan culture and religious identity. I've been to Mount Gerizim. I've watched the Passover sacrifice. I've read what I can for years regarding what makes the Samaritans and not something else. But I fully acknowledge I only have access to what is probably less than 1% of what any given Samaritan knows about their own heritage. And even if I knew more, that is not the same thing as if I could live and act as a Samaritan does. This is the difference between reading Neil Armstrong's book versus talking to Neil Armstrong myself versus stepping on the moon myself. I don't speak Hebrew. That alone means more than half of the books that actually do dive deep into Samaritan religion and identity are not accessible for me to read. Same goes with Judaism. I do not intend to diminish the significance of any persons. If I say something and it feels super objectifying, it is only because I am an outsider of any heritage or religious identity that is not my own. In other words, if you really want to understand the claims of who or what a prophet is or isn't from any of these religious identities, you would be far better off studying these traditions on your own, especially if you could talk to or speak directly with people about their own self-identities. Okay, 5. I say this to say I grew up Christian. I spent more time studying Christianity than probably 1,000 times over any other religious identity, because that is my own heritage and that's what I grew up with. And even though I have deconstructed Christianity as best I can, I acknowledge I can't fully escape its influence on me, which may be of particular issue when I speak about any other religious identity. I also am hesitant if I even fully want to deny Christianity as an identity for myself, as I do want to hold on to something. I can't be Samaritan and I wasn't born Jewish, but that is an entirely different conversation. So I say all this to say, my core belief is that Hashem makes Hashem's identity known through the use of humanity. So I am extremely pro-human. I am as much of a humanist as I am a theist. I do not want to diminish anyone. I want to uplift everything and everyone in their own significance, for their existence and uniqueness for who you are and what you bring to the table of life and the knowledge of humanity. In other words, I believe the law of identity makes every person and every tribe, nation, and culture uniquely unique, wholly defined. And I think we find life-giving meaning in exploring these things. And if I believed nothing else, I would still believe religion is the best paradigm or the acceptance for the acceptance of the diversification of people. For to me, this is very much the point of why God revealed the knowledge of God through the use of humans. And it is sad to me that the statement I just made is very much in conflict with normative religious claims. It is exceptionally rare you will hear someone say the differences between religions are to be celebrated and openly explored. It is far more normal for religious claims to be diminishing and suppressive of traditions outside of their own. But I'm putting the cart before the horse now. So let's continue on. So in the 1930s, It was the continued use of a footbath in Samaria that allowed an archaeologist to know that a footbath found in the 1800s BCE was also a footbath. So the question becomes, what else within Samaritan identity has the same lineage of ongoing tradition and use? For example, if you go watch the Samaritan Passover ritual today, how much did or does the ritual use today match or reflect that from the past? See, I'm convinced when we today read in the book of Leviticus the details pertaining to sacrificial procedure, and people go, this is stupid and holds no meaning for us today. That only feels true because we have completely separated ourselves from the sources of where our food comes from. That's obviously a different conversation, but I think if you are a Samaritan high priest and you are charged with the preservation of your people for millennia, the details on how you use the quintessential traditions and rituals of your own heritage is literally what preserves it. If you don't perform the Passover sacrifice, the use of the Passover sacrifice will be lost. So those sorts of details in how you sacrifice an animal immediately matters for the continued use of your own self-preservation. And if you aren't a Samaritan high priest, which none of us are, I simply do not think you can possibly understand the function of a text like Leviticus in its use. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning, and that doesn't mean it doesn't have value, and that doesn't mean it isn't worth learning what you possibly can about it, especially if you believe in a later developing religious tradition whose entire foundation for existing is the Torah. I can't go to the moon. I just have to accept Neil Armstrong's oral tradition of what the knowledge of stepping foot on the moon meant to him. I am okay with the oral tradition. I'm okay with accepting the words of another person as enough scientific standard for belief. I can't be a Samaritan high priest, but I absolutely will hold that perspective of the meaning of the Passover to the utmost highest standard. It is of immense value. And this is why there's a problem with historicism and scientificism in hermeneutics. See, we know scientifically the footbath was used as a footbath as recently as 1930. We also know the same object was found and dated archaeologically to the 1800s BCE. And so the assumption is, because it was seen to be used as a footbath in the 1930s, that means its use has been the same the entire time. So pick a moment in time, let's say 200 BCE, the assumption is the knowledge of the object's identity as a footbath hasn't changed because of its continued use. So all through time, the object's use has identified it as being what it is. See, the scientific burden of proof is what could be seen tangibly in 1930. We can't keep that same standard of proof to know the object's use in 300 AD or 200 BCE or 1800 BCE because we can't go back in time and observe the use. So everything before this moment in time, 1930, is an epistemological assumption based on continued use. And this burden of evidence is academically acceptable and is enough to make that a rational assumption. And what a good scientist or historian or archaeologist or anthropologist will try to do is continue to seek points of data to paint the best picture. So let's think about this. What other types of data can be used for evidence? Observation is probably the highest standard. Again, being literally on the moon is going to be the highest standard of evidence of whatever data you can make or claim about what it's like to be on the moon. So what other sorts of data, though, help solidify knowledge? So for example, I think one of the evidences of this object being a footbath is the fact that the one found from the 1800s BCE at Lachish was found in a city gate. And it's funny because the archaeologist who found it writes about the difficulty in dating the object because they couldn't rationalize why this object was found in a functioning fortified city gate. But to me, I think if it is a footbath, the fact it was found in a city gate makes perfect sense. Why? Because we read and we know from textual evidence, such as the book of Genesis, that people in the ancient Levant washed their feet upon entering cities, such as Hebron. That came up so many times when we were reading. So I'm not surprised to find a footbath inside of a fortified city gate. It makes sense. So textual evidence can be evidence. It obviously is not the same standard as first-person observation, but no other evidence is. So what is a scientist looking for? They are looking to see if its use changed. So what if tomorrow evidence was found of this object being used as a bread pan in 200 BCE? What would that be evidence of? Maybe one of these footbaths gets found inside of a clay oven and it's molecularly tested and remnants of bread and evidence of it being baked inside are found. Let's just assume that this was the case. What would that then tell us scientifically? So you might be tempted to say, well, if it was used as a bread pan in 200 BCE, then that means it is in fact always been a bread pan. So maybe in 1930, when the archaeologists observed its use as a footbath, maybe on that day it happened to be the first and only time in history in which it was used as a footbath. Maybe a child took a bread pan on a hot day and filled it up with water to splash water on themselves to keep cool. And it just so happened to be the time that the archaeologists saw this and was like, oh my gosh, it's a footbath. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time a child took pans and used them for something else. I remember taking cooking pans and using them to play drums before I had a drum kit. So I don't know if you know this, but all pans are actually, in fact, drums. When I didn't know how to cook, pans were drums to me. So is this a logical or accurate statement to make? If in the 1930s the pottery was used as a footbath, and if it could scientifically be known in 200 BCE it was used as a bread pan, would it then be appropriate to say at all instances in time it was actually a bread pan? Is that what the scientific data would be telling us? No. And this is the mistake a lot of people make in their use of science and history. The data is not telling you it is now only a bread pan or that it is now only a footbath. Evidence of a different use is only evidence in the change in use. So its use in the 1930s as a footbath is evidence of its identity as a footbath. That is the highest scientific fact pertaining to this object that can be known. And if there was evidence of its use as a bread pan in 200 BCE, all that evidence is telling you is sometime between 200 BCE and 1930 AD, the use changed. And additionally, this also would have no scientific merit on the use of the object in the 1800s BCE. That also could be up for question still. But the evidence from that archaeological site does favor it being a footbath as well. It contextually makes sense. So, if evidence was found of the footbath being used as a bread pan in 200 BCE, that is not evidence of this. It is only evidence of this. So scientifically, the reason the footbath is likely scientifically a footbath is because there is scientific evidence of its use as a footbath in the 1930s. In the context of the object found from the 1800s, with its use as a footbath as well. Those two things are rational scientific beliefs to hold. And there hasn't been any more data to be found in between. And there likely never will be. And certainly, there's no way you can go back and observe it being used between any of those points in time. So scientifically, it is logical and reasonable to assume this is actually the case. So here's the issue of science and historicism as it pertains to hermeneutics. The academic scientific burden finds this to be acceptable. This is how archaeology works. But epistemologically, it is reasonable to say we can't know for 100% certainty that the use didn't change at some point in the past. So it is reasonable to say that this actually is the case. There's evidence of the one thing, and there's evidence of the other. And maybe in the middle, it's a question mark. We know it was used as a footbath in the 1930s. The context of the archaeological site in the 1800s BCE also can fit as a footbath. And anything in between is likely a footbath, but it could have been used as something else at some point in time. So to reiterate, the academically acceptable scientific burden of proof is this. But the philosophical epistemological burden is this. But do you know what no amount of scientific inquiry will change? You know what the scientific data has no pertinence on? You know what the historical data of this object has absolutely no merit on at all? The fact that its use makes its identity known. And so all science can tell us is that its use potentially changed. But that doesn't negate the knowledge of its intangible use over time. So science can tell you that its use changed, but science can't tell you why it changed. And this is the point. Why it changed is part of its oral tradition. Every data point in the change of use that could possibly be discovered only points to more intangible, more unknowable data that can only be known by the ongoing use of the tradition of its people. In other words, the change in use is only indicative of its cognitive function. Change in use doesn't negate its use at any point in time. And this especially matters when talking about a culture such as Samaritan and Jewish cultures that were heavily reliant on their continued transmission of oral tradition as the bedrock function of their use. So here I'll give you an example. There's only one point in time where the epistemological burden of proof can be known. And that is documented in 1930 with its first documented use. But what if today you could go to Samaria and see people still using this object? If it is still being used as a footbath, then, well, that's it. There's no further discussion. But if it's being used as something else now, let's say a planter, no rational scientist or archaeologist or historian or anthropologist would say, well, today it's in use as a planter, So that means even in 1930, it must have also been a planter, right? How ridiculous would that claim be? Or worse, if you said, well, today it's used as a planter, so that means it was in fact always a planter. Absurd, right? It's just a ridiculous statement. If today you went to Shamerim and saw the foot bath being used as a planter, you wouldn't retroactively make everything in the past about this, right? Doesn't make any sense. The only thing scientifically that would be known is that its use changed. So you wouldn't say, therefore, it has always been this. At best, you're left with this. And so the question to ask would be, why did it change? And there might be scientific ways of inquiring for that answer, but no answer to that question would be a higher burden of proof than to simply ask the people who changed its use why they changed its use. And that would be a matter of intangible cultural heritage via oral tradition. Maybe a Samaritan might say, well, you see, we have bathtubs now and plumbing. So I no longer need to use this object that my great grandma used as a foot bath. So today I use it as a planter. All that science can tell you is maybe use changed. That's it. The only way to know why use changed is somewhere in the intangible knowledge of the cognitions of people themselves. And so the proper use of science can do this. With only one data point of direct observation and the same object found in the archaeological record at any given point in time, you can reasonably assume continued use via oral tradition and its reliability. This is a perfectly appropriate scientific academic standard of burden of proof of intangible identity. And archaeology as a field relies on this to have any chance at all in believing anything that can even be known. Or another framework of interpretation of this object can also leave you looking like this. You could take a philosophical approach with a healthy sense of skepticism, where you are trying to factor what can be known scientifically into the equation of epistemology. You might say, well, the data from 1930 allows me to reasonably know it's a foot bath, and it also seems to reasonably fit with the data known from the 1800s BCE. So I will healthfully assume in 1930 and in 1800 BCE, it is a foot bath. But I acknowledge the data in between the two known points of time could allow for a different interpretation. And this is fundamentally a philosophical statement. I personally find this to be the ideal place to be when it comes to learning about anything. My goal is to be in this space with most things and concepts. You will find, for me, what I do all the time, I'm trying to find the ends of a spectrum about anything. I'm obsessed with that. I do it all the time. This is literally how my brain thinks. So the science of the identity of the foot bath allows you to reasonably somewhere in between those two spaces. And the point I'm trying to emphasize is this. The acceptable scientific burden has a healthy philosophical space for doubt, and not to the point where the deconstruction of meaning is negated. It is equally valid to assume the foot bath is a foot bath from the data that is known, and it is equally valid to assume it is a foot bath, but maybe new information could be learned that can create a better picture as to the use and identity of the object over time. I know that was a lot. I hope all of that makes sense because we're going to continue. I'm sorry. Alternatively, the wrong use of science will create this paradigm, where all because any given scientific data point proves a change in use in the past, that you then retroactively apply that to everything prior and everything future, even to the point of negating other data points. I'll call this criticism, as I see this happen the most in the field of historical criticism. It ends up being severely diminishing of cultural evolution, fluidity in the function of people and oral tradition. I think this is a bad application of a scientific framework. And unfortunately, I think a huge amount of historicism of religious thought gets used for this purpose, especially in the academic fields. And I think it entirely misses the point. Another paradigm of the bad use of science can look like this. And I'll call this dogmatism, where factual statements are made that because something is the way it is today, that means that's how it used to be, or entirely changes or negates what once was. I see this so much in Christianity. And unfortunately, I think this is where a lot of people are stuck in their minds. Dogmatism is a retroactive process, and it is the counter to criticism. And so these two things are kind of constantly at odds with each other. Dogmatism looks back and makes everything the same. Criticism looks back, takes a point in time, and then goes forward and makes everything the same. To me, they're the same function of concepts, but one is backwards epistemology and the other is backwards epistemology in reverse. I could explain it like a car. It's like dogmatism is driving a car backwards in reverse on a one-way street. Criticism is like driving on a one-way street, turning your car around so you're now head-on in traffic, driving as far back as you can, and then putting your car in reverse to drive backwards in reverse to where you started. But now your car is just facing backwards. And so what I'm trying to say is, in terms of how people function, none of these things matter. Because the last category is this. I'm uncertain on what to call this. It's some combination of oral tradition, ritual use, religious thought, cognitive function. I'd even add evolutionary process, which is where use is allowed to change and it won't undermine the fundamental axiomatic principle that use determines identity. And a change in use is reflective of a necessary cognitive shift. And that is entirely compatible with preservation as it is its exact intended function. This is why I say if something's not historical, then history wasn't the intended function. Now, there's another category I can think of, and I'm inclined to say that this is a new concept, but maybe not. I don't know. I've been mulling this one over for a long time, and I just don't know. But and that's this. So you see this line here, and at the bottom it says epistemological burden of proof. This line, okay? This is the line of direct epistemological burden of proof. In other words, this is the point in time in which the highest standard for scientific evidence can be known and made, and that is by direct, first-hand observation of any given thing. So this last category I can think of are when people claim that the only knowledge that is acceptable to believe is anything that comes at or after this line. In other words, it is reasonable to doubt everything unless or until the standard of evidence is direct observation. And I personally think this category is the most dangerous of all of them. And the reason being, I believe that this standard of evidence is such a high standard that it negates one's ability to think and function. I want to call this category scientism, or the religion of science. When the standard for belief is only this line, it creates all sorts of issues for people. For example, I think if you take someone who has a healthy philosophical or scientific mind, meaning they can rationalize these about a thing, if you take somebody with a healthy philosophical and scientific mind, that they can have a very high standard for scientific evidence, and it doesn't create an issue for them or a negation of function. However, I think if you take someone who thinks or believe very critically or dogmatically, if you take somebody who thinks very critically or dogmatically and you apply a very firm, very harsh, very strict, rigid line for the burden of belief to be only direct scientific observation, what you get is what we were seeing more and more of today, where people end up believing things like flat Earth and QAnon. I think scientific thought, absent a proper understanding of the function of human use via oral tradition and cultural heritage, can lead to a cognition that doesn't necessarily function properly. Anti-human. I can speak firsthand to this myself. When I was embedded in Christian evangelicalism, I almost slipped into these sorts of denialisms due to a very rigid attempt of combating criticism that left me with a rigidness of scientific thought that was very much bringing me down a path, starting with 9/11 conspiracy theories when I was a child. I absolutely understand why conservatism today can so easily lead to something like QAnon conspiracy, because that is what you will get if you take the cognition of religious thought and apply scientific thought without a proper understanding of what science can't tell you. So you make your burden of belief so high you can't believe anything anymore. It was the study of the Torah that changed my cognition and allowed me to move past conspiracy thinking. This is one of the reasons why I'm such a big believer in the validity of 9/11 oral traditions, even if they are known to be scientifically or historically incorrect. The function of that memory for a person is by definition serving a different purpose than historicism, and to deny that of somebody misses the point. Okay, so why did we go through all of this? Because I'm not trying to be dogmatic about the Samaritans. I'm not trying to say how they do something today means that's always how it has been for them. I don't want what I'm saying to be misunderstood. I am not saying that because of a certain use in Samaritan culture today is what it is, that means that is how it has always been. However, I am saying their function has to be built in to be about this. And there are certainly things within Samaritan cultural heritage and ritual use that is absolutely scientifically reasonable to assume are like this. And I swear to God, if someone says, well, what evidence do you have for that? I'm going to scream. Because the foot bath is literally enough reason alone to say this. And I simply can't spend more time trying to make this very point. So here is why this matters. I understand all of these issues. I've thought a lot about them for years. And I want you to keep this in mind when we talk about religious identity and use of the biblical text. And specifically as it pertains to the Samaritans, because I think they have kind of a pass when it comes to frameworks that look like dogmatisms that I believe Christianity does not have. Christianity does not have a pass, and maybe that's my own bias, but it's what I see. Perhaps Judaism does or does not have a pass as well, but to me it's more forgivable, and we'll talk about that. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is I think one of the things criticism gets wrong is that something can be dogmatic for certain claims or identities, but may not be for others. At least this might be true exclusively for the Samaritans as it pertains to the biblical text. So for example, the Samaritans today might be the best insight and perspective into the use of the Torah to be found. I'll say that again. The Samaritans today might be the best insight and perspective into the use of the Torah to be found. And you might hear that and go, well, how do you know that or this or this or that or yada, 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 yada? And I want to go, bam. Because whatever you're about to say is going to fall somewhere on this chart. If you go watch the Samaritan Passover sacrifice this year, which is happening in 5 days from now, so get on a plane and go watch, you're left with this question. Is this ritual use how it's always been, or has it changed? And if you fall into the trap of making the use of that question about dogmatism or criticism in order to negate it, you'll miss what might scientifically be able to be known, or you'll miss the point of the ritual itself. Because the ritual itself is about this. If the Samaritan Passover has changed over time, aside from the issue of how would you even know if it did or didn't change, there's also the issue that the evidence of its change in use is only proof of a reason for its change, which only emphasizes the significance of their own oral tradition even more. It doesn't negate it. It's without more data that is likely impossible to know or reasonably find, at least without demolishing their own existence in order to find out. In other words, you got to tear all their stuff down and archaeologically dig. It is much more reasonable to assume at least this perspective when you are observing the Samaritan Passover, which for them is about this, for their own self-preservation. And so, yes, the Samaritans are a sort of window into the past. But tread lightly in saying that because we don't want to be dogmatic. But I do want to default to their own claim of self-identity. And if their oral tradition is a continuous longevity of the same rituals, then I don't see much reason to diminish that. And additionally, even if it is all just dogmatisms, a notion I strongly reject, but even if it is, Samaritanism might be the best foundation in understanding the dogmatisms of religious claims that come later, such as Christianity. So if I was an atheist, for example, and I hated religion, I would probably use the existence of Samaritans and the epistemological issues of prophecy as a foundational argument for deconstruction of God. You just have to ignore everything of value that also can come from it. And as I say, who wants to live in a world without beget? But whatever, moving on. So if we go all the way back to week 3, I discussed ideas like it's the differences between black and white that allow you to have a full epistemological understanding of this painting. Or like Matisse, it's the differences between the lines drawn and not drawn the differences between their colors that allows you to have epistemological knowledge of this picture. So for me, I think the differences between Judaism and Samaritanism is one of the most helpful methods of understanding both identities. And I'll even go as far as to say, I think has massive hermeneutic implications on the biblical texts. Starting with, again, the fact that Moses is the end for the Samaritans, whereas the story of Judaism continues to unfold in the Tanakh. That difference is massive. So going back to our key question last week, which path do we take? Where does Jerusalem come from? Why isn't Shechem considered the global holy city? The answers to these questions are the differences between Samaritans and Jews. And so let's go through some of the most important differences between Samaritans and Jews. And it's rather ironic to me because I think in general, most Christians and what they think of as being Judaism envision something that is much closer to some version of Samaritanism. And I say that from the perspective of both those religious identities. Your average Christian, in my experience, is completely oblivious to the essential attributes to what makes Judaism Judaism. And I personally think without this information, I really struggle to grasp what the heck Christianity is even trying to claim. But that's a later conversation. So what makes Samaritans Samaritans? Well, to start, both Samaritans are Jews, or both Samaritans and Jews are Israelites. So what does this mean? It means sons of Jacob. Jacob is Israel. You are an Israelite if you're a son of Jacob. But Jews are from the tribe of Judah. Samaritans are from the sons of Joseph, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh and the Levites. Judaism traces its lineage through mothers. Samaritans trace their lineage through fathers. Judaism is oriented by and to Jerusalem. Samaritans, everything is oriented around Mount Gerizim. Judaism holds that the Torah and the Tanakh as prophetic revelation. Samaritans hold only the Torah as an authoritative prophetic revelation. Now, this one is interesting. From the Samaritan perspective, Judaism only has 9 commandments, whereas the Samaritans have 10. But in Judaism, they believe they both have 10. In Judaism, the authority of the Torah is passed through rabbis. So we'll be talking a lot more about that in the coming weeks. But in Samaritanism, the authority of the Torah is through the Levite priests, which they still keep lineage of. In Judaism, the Messiah or Mashiach will come from the tribe of Judah. To the Samaritans, the Mashiach, also called the Taheb, will come from the tribe of Joseph or Levi. In Judaism, there is no temple, and thus there are no sacrifices. The Samaritans have a functioning temple to this day and keep ritual sacrifice, which is so interesting. Because Samaritans only eat meat that has been sacrificed at their temple. So the list goes on and on and on. And the more you add to it, the clearer the picture becomes. I think the Samaritans are able to practice probably the most literal interpretation of the Torah possible in today's world. And this has probably been the case for well over 1,500 to 2,000 years. So in other words, there are uses of the Torah in Samaritan culture that can help you understand the function of a commandment in the Torah in a way you simply might not be able to grasp otherwise. And this is interesting because it also helps in understanding what is Judaism. And this to me is probably the most important distinction. Samaritans have a right to claim a certain level of literal interpretation of the Torah. And it doesn't matter if the use changed. And if this is a point of distinguishing between Judaism and Samaritans, this might be the strongest. Because what does this imply about Judaism? Well, it implies that Judaism has a certain element of a non-literal interpretation built into their hermeneutic approach. And this is something that Judaism welcomes and embraces. So now I want to be very clear. My use of the words literal and non-literal might not be the best words to use to describe what I'm referring to, but what I'm referring to is something we will be discussing in the next few weeks. And I think it has a massive hermeneutic implication on texts outside of the Torah. So I'd like to read the following excerpt from Benjamin Zedekah, a Samaritan who has been dedicated to the knowledge of Samaritan identity globally. These are his own words regarding their own semantic identity. I'm just going to read. Oh, and also I have to read from the screen. Okay. We are not Jews. This is what the Assyrians called the people of Judea. The Jews adopted the name the Assyrians gave them. We are not Samaritans. This is what the Assyrians called the people of Samaria. We, the keepers, sons of Israel, keepers of the word of the Torah, never adopted the name Samaritans. Our forefathers only used the name when speaking to outsiders about our community. Through the ages, we have referred to ourselves as the keepers. We are not Palestinians. Most of those who call themselves Palestinians today are descendants of Jews and Samaritans who were forcibly converted to other monotheistic religions generations ago. This is supported by genetic research showing similarities in the DNA of Palestinians, Jews, and Samaritans. It is interesting to note that there are large Arab families in the Middle East today whose names retain the Samaritan and Jewish Hebrew forms. Even the Dadfi family, custodian of the Muslim holy sites on Jerusalem's Temple Mount, is of Samaritan origin. We are not Christians, nor are we Muslims. We are not Druze. We are not Adiki. I don't know. Nor are we Baha'is. We are not Shiites or Sunni Muslims, nor are we Alawites. So who are we? We are the children of the ancient people of Israel. If we ever left this land, it was because we were forced out against our will. In the last 127 generations since Joshua ben Nun entered the Holy Land, we, descendants of the tribes of Levi and Joseph, have remained faithful to the word of the Almighty of Israel, his prophet Moses, the Torah of Moses, and the chosen place of the Almighty, Mount Gerizim. The Israelite Samaritans are Hebrews, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yosef ben Yaakov is our father. Joseph gave birth to two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. When the Israelites entered the Promised Land, the land was divided into 12 tribes. The tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh had the Shamerim and Gilead regions. The tribe of Ephraim spread from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean coast. In this way, his inheritance encompassed settlements of the northern tribes and the tribes of the south. The tribe of Levi had no defined inheritance. Each tribe assigned cities to its territory. The heads of the tribe of the Levites sat in the territory of Ephraim. Other senior priests sat in the tribe of Judah. To this day, the sons of Aaron and their descendants are buried within the inheritance of the tribe of Ephraim. This heritage gives us our full title, the sons of Israel, keepers of the truth of the Torah. We shorten this to the keepers, or in Hebrew, Shamerim, or Shamari. This is how we have referred to ourselves down to the ages of the Israelite Samaritan Chronicles. Guardians of the true tradition of the people of Israel, we are faithful descendants of the ancient Israelite people. So far, we discussed who we are. Now, what are we? The Shamranim are a small community, part of the people of Israel, since before all the confrontations and tensions that characterize the Middle East today. We have our own script, ancient Hebrew. We have our own language, ancient Hebrew, as pronounced by our ancestors. We have our historical tradition spanning the thousands of years of our existence in the land of Israel. These three hallmarks distinguish us among the nations and make us proud of our continued existence as a minority people. In our prime during the 5th and 6th century CE, the keepers numbered around 1.5 million, and today we are only 760 individuals. But this is encouraging when we realize that today's population is more than 5 times the 1919 figure. Then we were only 141 individuals and very close to extinction. Today, our community is thriving, and unusually for the developed world, we have a low average age. The keepers are known to seek peace. We are not a people who stand on the sidelines watching other attempts to build bridges in the Middle East. We are the bridge of peace. Shamerim, the Israelite Samaritans, demonstrate this in our way of life as we seek to live peacefully alongside all the peoples of the Middle East. We are a model of coexistence and welcome all visitors to our neighborhoods. In turn, we are welcomed in the offices of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem, the President of the Palestinian Authority of Ramallah, King Abdullah al-Hussein II in Amman, the British Parliament and the Foreign Office in London, the White House and the State Department in Washington, D.C., and European community offices in Brussels. At our Passover sacrifice ceremony, you see crowds from all over the world there to observe the sacrifice. See the peoples of many nations meet in peace at the top of the mountain, not as Isaiah and Micah predicted in Jerusalem, but on the top of the chosen place of the Almighty, Mount Gerizim. See the mayor of Nablus, the Palestinian military governor, and Palestinian senior officers sitting together with senior officers of the Israeli Defensive Forces in an atmosphere of peace. In the same room are leaders of the Abrahamic religions and diplomats from all over the world, all gathered to honor the Samaritan Passover. This is the ancient Israelites' keepers' humble contribution to peace in the region. Perhaps for the first time since the days of our forefather Abraham, enmity between peoples in the land of Israel can be put aside, at least temporarily, and replaced by a feeling of goodwill. Along with our Holy Torah, we have a unique history, ancient and modern literature, special customs, ancient poetry and music, sports teams, and a rich social life. All of these an extensive archaeological site on Mount Gerizim and one of the oldest indigenous cuisines in the land of Israel, testify to our unique cultural and heritage. They are part of the fascinating story that attracts thousands of visitors to our neighborhoods and sites throughout the year every year. The Torah forbids missionary activity, but if someone decides they want to become an Israelite Samaritan, then conversion is possible. Potential male converts must be circumcised, and all who wish to become Israelite Samaritans must keep the Sabbath strictly as commanded in the Torah. They must read the Torah in its original text, as kept by the Israelite Samaritans, learn ancient Hebrew. Only the Samaritans have kept it without change, and keep the laws of purity regarding the human body and the family. They must keep the festivals as their proper times in the Israelite Samaritan calendar, keep the dietary laws, including, for example, not mixing meat with milk, and be honest and pleasant to one another. Not all Samaritans reside in the Holy Land. There are now Samaritan communities in Sicily, Brazil, and elsewhere, as well as many individuals who seek to live by Samaritan tenets. If anyone should need advice, I will be happy to help him or her. It is important to gather correct information about the Samaritans based on facts and found on this website, Benyan Zedekah. So we leave this here tonight. We could spend the rest of our lives studying Samaritans or the Shamerim in their own words, and part of me really wants to. But I also want to continue with the epistemological expansion of the knowledge of Hashem that is claimed in the Tanakh. And so next week we will take a step beyond Samaritanism. We will read a bit through Joshua as we move south from Shechem down the ridge route. So thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate all of you. So